you to go ahead and get started. Folks are still trickling in, but we have a lot of content and a lot of really, really great speakers here tonight. So I want to give all of them plenty of time to share with you all, and then of course leave time for discussions. This rounds out sort of a 3-week series that we've done, starting with human health. If you remember a few weeks ago, last week was animal health, and now the third piece of the One Health triangle, environmental health. We have 3 really incredible speakers: Melissa McHale, Cheryl Maximum, and Ellison Carter, all of whom come from different disciplines. And I think we'll share a really diverse picture in terms of how this might affect our work going forward. I just have something very quickly to share with the group. You probably got a Teams invitation from me sometime over the course of the day today. And I hope you can see this. This is what the Teams page looks like. I know we're giving you a lot of resources. And again, this course is very much trial and trial. Hopefully there'll probably be some errors along the way. This is how we have decided to do team conversation. So just a few things up front. There is a general page, but the channels are probably the more important pieces for each of you. So find your team over here on the left. Each team has their own channel. And then if you look, I've posted an introductory post that reminds you of your team members, reminds you of your site and the framework that you're working for. And so you can certainly start a conversation and get your team going. I'm honestly not sure if you're going to get notifications from all of the groups or not. I'm worried that you are. And so you can certainly mute these channels or delete the channels that you don't want to hear from. And so if you're getting too many notifications from other groups, just go ahead and mute those, or mute the channel and visit it once a day, something like that. The other tool up here is a direct link to our Google Drive. And so this again is all of our resources. The links to the lecture recordings are right here. And then all of our team presentations and team resources are here as well. So hopefully that works. Again, we're experimenting, so there might be a few hiccups, but appreciate your hanging in there with us, and let me know if that works well, or if you have other things that you'd like as we're building out these team resources. So with that, I think that's all I've got from my end of things. After this week of 3 meetings, we're going to start to go into the real meat of things. So starting next week, we'll start to think about the sites, a little bit more about how you actually build a city and a development, start to think about landscape architecture, building design, building code, things that are a little more contingent on our folks that are partnering with us from the city and some nonprofits around town. So last week of our grounding lectures, really, really excited to get our speakers up here. So without any more from me, I think Dr. McHale, I think you are the first one on my list. Are you ready to get going?
Sure, I can be ready.
Yay, welcome.
And I'm assuming I can just share my screen. I've
I
seen
think so,
that
yeah.
looks like it's available. So let me
Mhm.
do that. Okay, so can you see that?
Yeah, that looks great.
Awesome, perfect. So yeah, I'm Melissa McHale, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all. This is a really relevant and exciting course, and I've been trying to follow along as much as possible, even if it's while I'm making dinner on a Wednesday night. So everything's been awesome so far. I have a lot to share. I'm going to try to get through a lot in 10 minutes. I'm lucky maybe I'm from New Jersey, so I can talk fast, but we'll have time to talk after as well. So there is a link on the front of this PowerPoint, which I can share with you all for future reference. And that is a Salazar Center presentation that we've recently done. There's been a few of those, but I organized one on the state of the science, specifically related to conservation and human health. And so you might be interested in that as a resource for your class as well. I'm gonna say a few things that I did during that time, but there's also 5 other lectures, including someone you've recently had to, Liba Pinchar Goldstein. So maybe that's a reference. I have a lot more for you. I've heard Claire saying that you have a lot already though. So we don't want to overwhelm you with information. I got to see if I can click. I can. And what I'm going to try to do in 15 slides in 10 minutes is essentially give you an overview of an entire semester long course that I have, just so you know. So if this is like really up your alley and you figure that out at the end of this awesome experience with the One Health Institute, I also offer a sustainable cities course that goes for a semester. And I don't even have enough time in a semester to talk. So I'm just going to keep going here. Urban ecology and the study of urban ecosystems is a new field, relatively new. Modern day urban ecology is just been developing in the past 20 years. And how we develop cities has changed over time, and that really has changed our thinking on how we do our science. So for a long time, I think the industrial city, you know, that city that we all know in the beginning led to the development of just us spewing lots of pollutants into the atmosphere in the places that we lived, really transformed our understanding that we wanted to have healthier places to live. And so we developed sanitary cities. And sanitary cities, what the goal was, let's get all the waste and the pollutants out of the places we live as quickly as possible, because those industrial cities were not fun to live in, right? But then we realized there were also issues with the sanitary city, and that we were actually just taking pollutants and dumping them very quickly outside of the urban environment and causing problems for ourselves within the cities and for all the environments outside of the places that we live. And so now we're really moving towards thinking about how our science can contribute to developing sustainable cities. And of course, this is just an image of a dream that we have for the cities that we will build one day. But the idea is that our cities will be functioning ecosystems that are good for us and all the other species that like to live with us. The one thing that I think we have to be on the same page with as we move forward is that cities are ecosystems, right? And that shouldn't be hard for people to accept, because in essence, we can say anything is an ecosystem: a pond in a backyard, a neighborhood, even an amusement park, right? All these things can be considered ecosystems, because when we study ecosystems, we're just thinking about a boundary, an area, and the abiotic and biotic interactions. And what's great about thinking about cities as ecosystems is they just become more complex and interesting with people in them. I'd like to propose that cities are also natural ecosystems. So you'll hear a lot of terminology associated with the study of complex social ecological systems that say things like coupled human natural systems. And I really, really tend to steer away from that language, because natural is a word throughout history that's been used to marginalize people and make people feel like there's one right path. And that also, it happens to be used often to make us think that things that humans do aren't natural. And we are. I think we are just like other ecosystem engineers in the world. And we need to start thinking about the places that we built as ecosystems that are natural. And that could be doing that we could be designing these places to even provide more ecosystem services than we've had even with our quote unquote traditional or natural ecosystems. You probably heard a bit about this last week with Liba around, but we often tend to think about biodiversity in cities as well, and that humans in development are what's causing this mass free fall in diversity, this mass extinction that's happening around the planet right now. But I really like David Attenborough's perspective on this, where he says that we need to think about the newest habitat on Earth and all the opportunities that that new space can provide us for us to create cities as sanctuaries for biodiversity. And I've seen evidence for that in my work in Africa. So as an urban ecologist, I have a lab, and this is kind of the framework that I use to organize most of our research that we work on. And there's questions that go along with this framework. And they link people, animals, and ecosystems, actually. So the first question that we tend to think about in my lab is, what does land use and land cover really tell us about ecosystem function and the provisioning of ecosystem services? How does the provisioning of ecosystem services affect people's health and well-being and potentially change human behavior? And how do changing human behaviors feedback and influence ecosystem structure and function? Now, I've done this kind of work in a lot of different cities across the United States and internationally. One of my favorite things to do is compare cities and to think about how we can make them healthier places and why they should be different in terms of achieving our sustainability goals. But since you're focusing on your project on Fort Collins, I figure I will just spend the next few minutes just giving you some background on some of the research that we have locally. We love to work with the city of Fort Collins. They're my personal favorite partner in the entire world. I'm not kidding. Get to work with a lot of different departments, and I really am grateful that they put up with me and share all kinds of data of information. Recently, we've been taking this information and helping and working with them to put these kinds of data on data portals. And they've also been able to use our maps and resources for their budgets and to figure out plans for some of their future work. So I think that this is the best thing I could possibly work on in the world. And Fort Collins is the home, that always been the home of my heart. So here we have a land cover map of the city of Fort Collins. What we did was took aerial imagery and we created a land cover classification. We were able to determine where every single tree is in the city, including all those other land covers in a lot of detail. We know now that Fort Collins has about 14% tree cover overall, depending on you're talking about which boundary you're talking about. And that's comparable. So most cities across the United States on average have about 20% cover. Raleigh, for instance, though, that is in a temperate ecosystem, has about 60% cover because they grow in a place that trees are easy to grow. That trees grow without human inputs. So the amount of places that have trees in Fort Collins is quite impressive, as is our forestry department. Some of the things that have come from that work is we're realizing that even in this very new and developing city with only about 160, 180,000 people, depending on when you count and who's telling you and what year, that we're starting to see some evidence of inequities developing. So neighborhoods that have more minorities don't have as much tree cover and have more impervious surfaces. We're seeing some interesting things when we compare Fort Collins to other places around the globe, things that you wouldn't expect to see in other places. So for instance, downtown areas tend to have less tree cover in temperate cities. And in Fort Collins, that's where most of our tree cover is. And that is because those are the oldest parts of town, right? And that's where our trees have had a head start and time to grow. And so we know that these trees will provide services, and we need to think about why there are trees in certain places and why not. What are the historical contexts for that? And what we can do to provide more services to more people into the future, especially with climate change. One of those things that we've been asked to look at in more detail by the city of Fort Collins was we had to think through, are we worried about the urban heat island effect here? And so what you're seeing on the left-hand side is a map, a satellite image of land surface temperature. And we combined that with our land cover data and saw quite clearly that the areas that don't have tree cover or water are definitely hotter already in our city. And so if we're seeing inequities develop in terms of tree cover, then that could be a problem for human health, right? And also biodiversity and ecosystem function. All these things are related. We're very interested in human behaviors. We've been able to work with utilities to look at water consumption and whether or not land cover outside people's homes and some of their predictors of human behavior, what they do for outdoor water use. 60% of the water that we use in this city is used outside people's homes. And so this becomes a really important question for us. And we've found things like, so I'm just showing you lots of different correlations between the variables I'm talking about and all the variables that we can study, just because it's just easier to visualize. But just to give you some perspective, out of all the variables that we study in terms for water use, for instance, we found that higher socioeconomic status households use more water. We found that those places that are warmer in the city, that have higher land surface temperatures, are also use more water. People that have more grass in their yards use more water. Some interesting things too. If you have trees, you are more inclined to use less. And actually, if you have smaller parcels, you use more water. And I love that result, not because I want people to use more water, but because it's really interesting. So we can talk about that later. I can feel myself running out of time right now. We're looking at things also like households' energy consumption. It's very hard to get data like this in other cities, but because we have our own utility in Fort Collins, we can work closely with water and energy utilities to figure out what are the trade-offs between water and energy consumption. And one of the things that I'm really excited about continuing a conversation on, we've been writing some proposals on this, yet to get funded, but they will someday. We've been talking a lot, even with some people that have been involved, like Kelly and Kate, about the ecosystem services that are provided on some of our open spaces. And so in Fort Collins, I'm sure you've noticed we have a lot of open spaces like this picture here on the left, which is actually right outside my back door. There's just a big grassy area that every once in a while fills up with water and keeps our city from flooding. It was an effective strategy. It's worked because we used to have a lot bigger floods in town. But we need to now take those spaces and think more about how we can provide more ecosystem services to people, especially now in the context of COVID. These are the kinds of spaces that have actually picked up a lot of use because they're closer to people's homes and people need more space. So I have a lot of ideas on how to study this and work with this in town. And hopefully we can talk about that more in the future. We do have the Urban Sustainability Research Network. It's slowed down a bit since we're not allowed to socialize. The whole goal of the network was to bring people together from the city and CSU, including students, and also other stakeholders that are interested in sustainability in Fort Collins, to socialize and work together and develop trust and build projects. That's been harder this past year, but this has definitely been a realm that a lot of us have been interested in, and I think will continue as our lives get more back to normal. We'll never be normal again, but we'll get closer. So that is the end of my rant, my 10-minute rant. Hopefully I didn't go too much over.
No, not at all. That was perfect and a very well done rant if it was that indeed. So thank you so much, Melissa. We appreciate it. A great sort of introduction and then bringing it back to the city that we're focusing on. Really appreciate it. Okay, I think next up we have Dr. Cheryl Magsamen. Dr. Magsamen, are you with us?
I am here, and I am going to take my keep my camera off. I just came off a 4-hour conference call, so I'm a little tired. Not at my best, but I will share my slides. And some of you I know, so it's good to see you again. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, great. So I am a respiratory epidemiologist in the Department of Environmental and Radiological Health Sciences. Most of my work focuses on chronic respiratory disease, specifically asthma and COPD. And I came from a background of really trying to understand the health disparities surrounding respiratory disease, where especially communities of color tend to have a higher prevalence of both asthma as well as COPD, and trying to figure out, given all the complexities of resource challenged neighborhoods, if we can figure out what the causal link is outcome. And that happens to run in a realm of different types of exposures, like housing quality, quality of healthcare, environmental quality, access to healthcare, built environment, as well as other things that are related in terms of roads and air quality. So over the somewhat long course of my career, which is crazy to think, it doesn't feel that long already, and especially moving to Fort Collins in 2013, I've tended to focus a lot more on trying to understand the mixtures of relative contribution of social factors and environmental exposures on chronic disease outcomes, again, focused on respiratory health outcomes. So I don't know if anyone thinks is ever on the Purple Air website. This is something that is really kind of new and exciting in the field of air pollution research, and hopefully, and Dr. Carter is an expert in this field, so hopefully she'll tap into this. But this idea about You know, we breathe every second of every day and we can't stop. And if we do, we die. So understanding the quality of our air is really critical to understanding not only of our respiratory health, but our total health also. And increases in technology, especially in areas such as ours, where there is such a focus on environmental quality, have really promoted our understanding of the impacts of not only environment and our health, but the changes in technology that we can leverage and improve environmental exposures, improved collection of data for environmental exposures to leverage for health outcomes. So this is a Purple Air Monitoring Network for one of our criteria pollutants, PM2.5, fine particulate matter, which can be inhaled and penetrate deep into our lungs and has implications not only for our respiratory health, but cardiovascular health, as well as many, many organ systems. So this is not a great day for us here in Fort Collins. And it actually took me by surprise, but generally because of potential atmospheric inversions and it's a cold day, so we have potentially a lot of fuel consumption at the household level. We have fairly poor air quality today. So we're just a little note about things that I try to pay attention to in day to day, and this is available on the Purple Air website, which you can just Google and look at what our community looks like basically on an hourly basis. It's pretty exciting. But given that this is a One Health topic conversation, I wanted to point the direction of our conversation slightly differently to some of the research that we've been doing in One Health specifically. One of the challenges that we have in air quality epidemiology is specifically looking at populations that potentially don't have air quality monitors. Air quality monitors are generally cited by where populations live and in places that are potentially rural. So we do have several rural areas in Colorado, both on the western slope and the eastern plains. We just don't have the same capacity to understand air quality as we do in more urban environments with a denser air monitoring network. And that poses a challenge because the air quality in rural or less heavily populated regions might be quite different in terms of the constituents. For example, more agricultural emissions, potentially more oil and gas emissions, or more pollen and different bioaerosols, as Dr. Michaela was speaking of earlier. So because we don't really have a dense air monitoring network and we don't really have a whole lot of people, which generally is important when you're doing an epidemiologic study, one of the ideas that we had was that can we use dairy cows as sentinels species to understand the impacts of air quality on mammals. And this was research that was led by one of my MPH students, Heather Martinez, who's now with the State Public Health Veterinarian's Office at CDPHE. And I am grateful for letting Heather share her slides. Those of you who are in Dan Salkeld's One Health class, this might seem familiar. So thanks for bearing with me. So just in terms of the health effects, not only particulate matter, but ozone, another criteria pollutant, which is a secondary pollutant formed by the combination of volatile organic compound and nitrogen dioxide emissions with the photochemical processes involved with heat and light produce ozone, which is not good for us. And unfortunately, all the sunshine we get in Colorado means that our Front Range area has high ozone levels. So we have health effects of ozone and PM, again, throughout our systems. And because cows are mammals, we wanted to know that if they had potentially the same effects that we do. So we know that from other studies that dairy cows are sensitive to environmental conditions, and that dairies collect data on cow health and milk production quality daily and have a rich data set that we can leverage to understand potential implications of air pollution health effects on some of their outputs, maybe not their health to start with, but because milk production is a 24-hour, 365 process, they were able to look at the quality of milk and the production of milk in terms of its relationship to air quality and temperature. There are very few studies on livestock and air pollution. Livestock is not actually covered under the EPA mandate for protection that really focuses on humans. And yet, if there are negative implications of air quality on livestock, this might have negative economic impacts for livestock producers, as well as negative health impacts for the animals as well. So why Colorado specifically? We are the 9th largest producer of dairy products in the United States, California being #1. But our Northern Front Range metropolitan area is out of attainment for ozone and has been since 2008. And Colorado consistently experiences wildfire plumes and high levels of PM 2.5, as we did last summer and as we're experiencing today. So we do have a fairly large cattle and livestock industry, and generally areas with large cattle populations often coincide with areas with no air pollution monitoring. But here on the Northern Front Range, we have what I've been terming the AGWI, which is the agricultural urban interface, where we have ag communities that are very close to heavily populated communities like we have here in the I-25 corridor. And just to point out a quick map of those graduated point markers are those that have are the size of the livestock in each of the counties, as well as the human county map indicates, the human population in each of those counties. So from 3 Front Range dairies, we were able to get data for 2 summer seasons, looking at somatic cell count, which is the measure of milk quality that comes from a bulk tank once cows are milked, and is important because there's a legal limit for milk for human consumption based on the number, somatic cell count in the milk samples. And then we were actually also able to get the average daily milk production per cow in pounds per cow per day, and for every milking cow on these 3 dairies. And again, what I mentioned previously was that there is a known relationship between temperature and milk production, and that there's a nice kind of sweet spot where cows like to exist, where it's not too hot and not too cold. Once it gets too hot, as it does here in the Front Range of the summer, milk production decreases. But we also know that summertime here on the Front Range means that ozone levels go up, as well as potential wildfire exposures, again, as we had last summer. So the research that we did showed that this is for somatic cell count, that somatic cell count was associated with temperature, which is abbreviated here, temperature humidity index. But once we adjust for the levels of PM 2.5, that relationship between temperature and somatic cell count decreases. So we think that PM 2.5 here is an unmeasured confounder in the relationship between temperature and somatic cell count, meaning that what really potentially is the impact of air pollution is now being attributed to temperature when we don't account for these air pollutants in the model. And similarly, we find a very similar effect when for milk production, we account for PM 2.5 and air pollution in a model that also looks at temperature and humidity, that there's an expected inverse relationship. As it gets hotter, there's less milk produced, but once we add PM into that model, that the attribution of that effect is actually more for the air pollution rather than the temperature impact itself. So some of our takeaways from this is that not only are there important implications of air quality for humans, but also non-human mammals such as livestock populations, and economic implications and consequences for dairy production and livestock. And currently, one of our challenges is that a lot of conversation around livestock production has to do with negative air quality, for example, methane production and climate forcing pollutants, where I feel like a lot of the conversation has to do with blaming the livestock industry for our depressed air quality, especially again with climate forcing pollutants. However, the activities that we engage in as kind of these anthropogenic activities, as well as these natural events like wildfires, also have adverse health implications for our livestock production animals. And I totally agree with Dr. Mihail in thinking that we are a system, and that changes in air quality don't only impact us, but all of the biodiversity that surrounds our communities as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully I'm within time.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. We're pretty loosey-goosey around here with time, so nobody was keeping track, but that was a really wonderful presentation. Dr. Magsamon's research team was a recipient of one of the One Health 2019 pilot grants for that Cows as Canaries study that you saw. So a really nice example of what One Health can do in the research space and how to bring together all these different stakeholders to the table. All right, we have one more speaker tonight. I think I saw Ellison Carter on the call. Dr. Carter, are you with us?
Yep, hello.
Hello there. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Um, well, hello, everyone. I don't know everyone that's in the room, but I'm really glad to be presenting alongside Dr. Magsman and Dr. McHale. I think that one of the reasons I was invited to potentially contribute to your class is to talk a bit about where work that I do as an air pollution engineer, civil and environmental engineer, focuses on air quality issues, how that has intersected with some of the topics that relate to One Health, and in particular your class around healthy cities. I won't be presenting any slides, but I would, certainly welcome questions. I think I can see about a third of the class, and would be glad to take a raised hand if something's not clear, but I know that questions are also being saved for the end. So I wanted to, in thinking about how the work I do might relate to the topics in your class, I'd like to highlight maybe 3 settings where the work that I do is approached maybe similarly from a method standpoint, but in terms of the types of questions that we're asking, they differ a little bit in each setting. So the first setting that I'm going to talk about is in China, where I've been working for 8 or 9 years now, and it's in more of a rural peri-urban setting, or a rural setting that's becoming more urban as cities and the ways that cities work sort of migrates out and absorbs these rural areas where the studies that I've done are located. So the second project I'll mention is based here in Fort Collins. I've been working with the city's Efficiency Works Homes program for about 2 years now. And then the third project is one that I joined late, so I'm not sure if Cheryl mentioned it, but Cheryl and I both collaborate with a larger team that spreads across the Colorado School of Public Health, based in Denver in the Sun Valley community. So just briefly, my main focus area as a researcher has been on indoor environmental science and engineering. I focused in my PhD, I came in thinking I wanted to do ecological engineering to the program at University of Texas in civil and environmental, and learned a lot about exposure in my first year. And exposure science took me in the direction of indoor environments where people spend a lot of their time and are potentially exposed to compounds that they may or may not have very much control or agency to minimize. And so the focus of my work in my PhD was on formaldehyde in manufactured housing. I sort of date myself, I guess, but I started my PhD just after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita had put people in temporary housing that made them sick. So I focused a lot on formaldehyde, and that gave me a really rich opportunity to learn about housing and housing policy and how it related to air quality and personal exposure to air pollution. So I took that training and continued and still work in China, where one of my projects currently focuses on the province of Beijing. So most of us know Beijing as a city, but the province is a larger area. It includes many rural regions, and most of those rural settings, coal has been the primary residential fuel for heating. And heating is needed 4 to 5, maybe even 6 months, some years. It's a cold climate. And so as a country, China is trying to address air pollution, and then specifically in rural settings, they're trying to transition many millions of households from coal space heating to cleaner space heating options like natural gas and electricity. And so we've had the opportunity with our partners at Peking University and Tsinghua University, as well as collaborators I work with at McGill, to study this problem from a number of different angles. And we've enrolled 50 villages for the past 2 years. We have another season coming up the next winter. We took a pause last year for because of the pandemic. And what we've been able to do in those 50 villages is measure outdoor air quality, personal exposure to air pollution, as well as cardiovascular and respiratory health outcomes, which is not my area of expertise, but our larger team addresses.
I'm happy to take questions. I think the other 2 are off. I can tell you all kinds of things. Like I'll just like throw data at you if you guys want. So just let's go.
Oh yeah, I wanted to follow up on the question I'd asked, where it's really cool seeing that land cover map. I was curious what kind of methods were used to classify it.
Yeah, so I think I wrote you back. Are you Daniel?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I wrote you back a bit. So NLSD is a 30-meter resolution tool. And we used imagery and all kinds of other data from the city of Fort Collins to create an object-oriented classification that is 1 meter resolution. So with 30-meter resolution, that's a huge difference, because what it means is you get big red blobs of urbanization. And I think that gives everyone the perspective that red is bad and just taking over other places. But when you start really looking into what those land covers are, you can then begin to think, what is the real structure of the urban environment, and how do we design that, change that, implement other strategies for making it so that that heterogeneity can actually support other ecosystem services for people. It really changes the perspective a lot.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
I guess I have a question too. California, I think they passed some kind of law or policy that they're phasing out gas in their new builds. And I honestly don't know too much about this. I'm a veterinary student, but I was wondering kind of what your opinion would be on that, not just in the long term of phasing out gas in new buildings, but like the short term of what that looks like with electricity without having like a renewable infrastructure.
Right. So, and I've been seeing a lot of this, right? Because if we can get, like with Fort Collins utilities, if they become mostly renewable, we don't want people to have gas stoves and stuff, right? That's what you're talking about. And this is an interesting conversation. You know, I've been talking to the city about it, and it seems like they're not having as much of an issue as I thought that they would. Because, so this is the thing about urban ecosystems, right? And I'll use an example relating to outdoor environments, because that's a lot of what my research is. You know, we've seen evidence of when people take their yards and we saw this in Phoenix, Arizona, very clearly. They remove their lawns and they put up these, you know, cactus-like desert environments. And so we get them to do that, and then they still don't reduce their water, right, use, because they water the hell out of their cactuses because they want them to flower. And so the thing is that there's all kinds of changes that we make, and it's so hard with the urban system, and also so interesting. That's why I love studying it, because you really don't know what to expect, right? And you really have to make sure that what you implement actually has the outcomes that you think it's going to. I thought, especially for gas stoves, because I personally do not want an electric stove. I like the time, like when I could finally cook on a gas stove, I was so excited, and I appreciate it every day. And so I think that there might be some of that switchover challenge in terms of what people prefer and like. But I don't know. I mean, I think I can't predict how this is going to go, and I can see why. And I'll probably be guilted into trying to like an electric stove at some point.
Did you talk about your point you made earlier about high water usage with small parcels?
I know. Does anyone have any guesses on why that would be?
They're not xeriscaping?
Yeah, well, right. No, that's true. We're about to try to look into some more of the data on xeriscaping and
Oh.
so, but
I know when you have a large yard, it's a pain in the butt to water, so you don't. Because we live on an acre, and so like we're not going out irrigating our acre of like
yeah.
we don't even plant grass. You know what I mean? Like we have lawn, but it doesn't get watered like a lawn.
Yeah, so I do want to suggest, I do want to let everyone know that right now, most of our work in Fort Collins, because I just came back a few years ago and we just started all these land cover analyses and things. And so a lot of our work right now is like correlation analysis. What are the relationships? we haven't totally gotten into what the mechanisms are yet. And we can only guess at what the mechanisms are between some of these relationships until we, because of other research that's been done elsewhere, or, you know, also as we start to study the city more and delve into why certain places are different, we'll be able to say more. But I have a few guesses on this. And one of them is that HOAs are playing a role, the housing associations. So a lot of the areas that have smaller properties have very strongly opinionated and not very well educated. I'm sorry, I really hate HOAs. You know, so they have all of these things, right, that they implement. And so people get really obsessed about keeping a small patch of lawn very, very green. Right. And I think people, like you said, that have larger lawn, like larger yards are just like, this is impossible. Why would I even try? And you're also less likely to be forced into the situation of having a green lawn. So there's
We
all
live in
these,
the county, so yeah.
yeah. So there's all these neighborhood norms, and also HOAs add to that, right? That help, that make us do things that maybe we wouldn't normally do. So we've seen this with people's landscapes. They often do something different in their front yard than their backyard, because their front yard is for their neighbors and they base their designs on what they think their neighbors want them to do. And their backyards, they do a lot of what they feel like they would prefer in their own lives. And you can actually see how this translates into ecosystem function, right? Like we've seen in Raleigh, North Carolina, that backyards become really great ways to capture rainwater because people have so many trees in their backyard because of that kind of landscape preferences and cultural and social norms manifestation in the urban environment. I'm seeing a question over here on the right about golf courses being great for biodiversity. You guys are hitting on all the fun questions. Yeah, and so there's some work, if you guys are interested in the different kinds of open spaces in cities and how they support different biodiversity. There's some great work coming out of the Urban Wildlife Information Network on that. And I think there's a bunch of cities really trying to do this work. And overall, you know, cemeteries can be amazing places, right? Sorry, my light's not working in my office. That's getting darker and darker in here. So we need an electrician to fix it. It's not just a bulb. How many PhDs does it take to change a bulb? It's not that. It's essentially like I have to bang on the wall to get it to work. Okay, so anyway, that tangent. So different kinds of open space and support different biodiversity. They also support people and recreation and health differently, right? And so when we start, you know, you get me and Kate talking about, you're working with Kate a lot, you know, this 10-minute walk data, you know, so that's a first start. Let's make sure that everyone has a safe and accessible 10-minute walk to an open space. But are they the open spaces that people want to have access to? Are people able to get from those open spaces the things that they want to, right? There's been cultural differences shown, like we've seen in Phoenix, for instance, that the Latinx community feels more comfortable in the more managed open spaces where they can cook for their large families and play games. Whereas there's been, you know, some of the Caucasian and higher income feel more comfortable trying to get into nature and seeing wildlife, right? And there's probably some real long-term historical and cultural reasons for those differences in people's preferences. And so we really need to make sure that people have access to the right spaces, but also our wildlife. And you can see really cool differences in biodiversity based on the kind of environment and what we're doing to manage. And even in those highly managed recreational spaces, we've seen if we can increase native diversity, if we reduce mowing and we also increase vertical complexity, we can bring back some of the biodiversity that we have lost. I'm probably missing questions on this side, so Claire, you might have to help me out. And anyone can jump in like with experiences. We don't have to make this the Melissa show. And Ellison, if you're listening, you are welcome to come back at any time.
I think it's just going to be you, Melissa.
Okay.
So, but others, I don't know if Kelly, I know Kelly Smith is on the call. There may be others who would like to weigh in here.
I'll go ahead and ask a question that occurred to me because my husband is a tree lover, and it seemed like a lot of the positive correlations you talked about, Melissa, had to do with trees. So what
We spend a
about,
lot of time, Sue, talking about trees in the city because they are such a major part of the provisioning of ecosystem services.
Mhm. And
Sorry.
are there certain kinds of trees that are better than others? Because the trees we have around our house were not living here
Are
originally.
they cottonwoods? Oh no, they're non-native. Okay, this is another one of my favorite topics. So everybody is into this, like everything has to be native, and trees aren't native, right? And we've been having this conversation in the city too. Like if trees fall, like come down with emerald ash borer, because green ash isn't a native tree, right? To Fort Collins. Then if we have all these ash trees, should we be replacing them, right, with other trees that aren't native? So there's a few things coming into play here, right? So if you believe me that urban areas are natural ecosystems and cities are, I'd like to propose that there are species that are native to cities, and green ash is one of them. The other thing is, you know, the native trees we're seeing. So if we're talking about water provisioning and all these different like services, I'm going to take you out. Just my kid might interrupt now too. I'm going to come out where you can actually see me. Where there's actually light. If you were to start looking at water use, we can get Troy Oakletree and a few others involved in this. If you were to start looking at water use for different species, we're noticing that it's those quote unquote non-natives that use less water. So Diane Bataki did a study out in Utah, similar semi-arid kind of city, and found that it was the non-native trees that were really good at water conserving. And the native trees like the cottonwoods, once they have water, they drink it. And that's their thing, drink and grow. And so in some ways, our ecosystems would be better off by using some of these quote unquote native to cities trees, right? Because they also then grow healthier too, because they can actually usually take the stresses that come in. And now Fort Collins, if you talk to the city foresters, they're struggling, right? The species list is dwindling on the number of the kinds of trees that really do well in our urban ecosystem. Ours in particular, because of the different kinds of stresses we have, like these early frosts or late snowstorms, they really struggle. And so some of the trees that have done well in our system over time are starting not to do well, and they're dying quite quickly. Even trees that people might not appreciate, like Siberian elm, once they start dying in one winter, we start to wonder, maybe we've really got to think through with climate change, what are the species that are really going to enhance our urban environment and provide us with more services into the future as things change and get harder. Yeah, I'm kind of controversial with all this stuff. And so, you know, I just think that we impose like all these restrictions on ourselves, and we just need to think big, right? We need to think about cities as these designer ecosystems, as these places that could do so much more for us than we ever thought about, right? We can actually build in Phoenix, I have friends that are building wetlands in the desert to help clean water before it goes back into the streams, right? And you're thinking, oh my God, build a wetland in a desert. But the thing has been amazing. It's been super functional. It's done what it's needed to do. It's attracted wildlife. It's provided recreation for people, bird watching, all kinds of things. And so, you know, the world's changing around us every day. And so maybe we need to embrace that a little bit more.
Thank you.
Any other questions over here? I'm trying to read the IRB rejected my proposal to change the light bulb. Hey, our Colorado State University IRB is really awesome, I have to say. They're not as bad as some of the other universities. They're really strict with making sure students have qualifications and that we're all like up to date on our certifications. But in terms of getting our proposals like and helping us do everything that we need to be good, ethical social scientists, I think they do their job very well.
Melissa, I have a question. I'm a pediatrician, so I'm a kind of a human physician. And so from that perspective, have there been studies on indoor air quality and houseplants? Is there any effect of houseplants? Is it kind of maybe more of like a mental health greenery type of thing? Do you know of any data on that?
I have not gotten into that literature recently. You know, a lot of the work, again, because I focus a lot on outdoor environments, I know that there's been really cool work showing that just having greenery outside of your window, if you're in a hospital, you'll heal faster. If you're in a low income apartment and your kid has ADHD, your kid is more likely to be able to pay more attention if there's more greenery outside. There's all these correlations coming out that I think we need to work out the mechanisms for. So with that in mind, I suspect that indoor plants provide some of the similar benefits. And that there probably is more research that I'm not sure about. And I bet some of our engineering friends that were just with you today would have some of those resources since they think a lot about indoor air quality. What I love about the indoor air quality people is they teach me things all the time. There's some of the engineering folks that have taught me that some of the things that I like in my home, like those really schmancy oils that you volatilize in your home that are citrus and make you feel like you're at a spa. Those that actually decrease your air quality in your home. Sucks.
And then the other question, and I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this one, but the other question I saw in the chat was about air pollution and smoke and the effect of COVID susceptibility. And if there's data on there, I think there's probably a lot of confounding variables
I
there
think
too.
right now with COVID, we're just still on the learning track. But if you could find a lot more information about outdoor air quality and urban environments, there's a lot of that we could totally talk about, right? And you know, for a lot of the models are predicting that trees can do a lot for us in the outdoor environment with our air quality, but they also have some negative impacts too. And so sometimes we have to evaluate these trade-offs. So for instance, trees can actually emit VOCs, and some species of trees emit them more, and especially unhealthy trees and stressed out trees tend to emit VOCs more. And VOCs are a precursor to ozone, right? And so there's just some things I think we need to balance. And sometimes the tree canopy has been able to, you know, take out particulates and also help us filter the air using stomates, but then also depending on the vertical structure and the way that the wind flows through, you can actually get places where trees keep emissions closer to the grounds where people breathe and actually help again for the creation of more ground level ozone. And so that's why the cities are so important, right? And it's not about studying, you got the indoor and the outdoor environment, right? And I'm getting more into that because as we're studying consumption and human behaviors, you've got to start actually analyzing human behaviors in the home to understand how they're manifesting outside the home. But in terms of, really thinking through how we're going to create the spaces that are the healthiest, there's so many factors that come into play. And that's why I end up being that person that studies a lot of different things. I get really jealous over and like envious of my colleagues who, it's like they study this thing and they know like everything back and forth about it. I end up having to study carbon, I study carbon cycling, water cycling and quality, stormwater runoff, human behaviors, landscape preferences, the list goes on, right? And like biodiversity, like I want to set up cameras all over the city, trying to get money now so we can look at wildlife human interactions and like continuity and patterns like that. And like, I think if we really want to create these spaces for the future, we have to bring these things in together because the trade-offs need to be really considered. You got 2 minutes.
Yeah, we've got
5
time
minutes.
for maybe 2 more questions if everybody's got one.
Hey, Melissa, I have another question about trees.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
We've talked about this a lot. There's not a whole lot of native trees, especially tall native trees. But what about short native trees? I mean, I want to plant a bunch of Gamble oaks at my house, but they only get 20 feet tall, so you're not getting a lot of like canopy shade. But do they still provide you know, the other benefits of, you know, increased water filtration and air filtration and all of that? Or is it really the main service you're looking for in an urban environment from a tree is really tall shade cover?
You know, the models have told us that the bigger, the better, right? And I'm not convinced. I think that, especially in a semi-arid city, we need to think about, we talked about this, right? Specific location and what's around it and what's really needed there in that place and by the people and the animals and the ecosystem. And I think there is, you know, and also, so bigger may be better sometimes because of the shade, but also a lot of those models are about the leaf area index, so how much leaves there are. And then also you've got this habitat thing, right? A lot of models don't actually express. So people are very focused on just a few ecosystem services. And I think like what Gamble oak and some of these other species do may be being left out of the conversation because we're just not measuring it, right? And so Gamble oak as one of those species that does have a lot of leaf area, and I think could be providing, you know, and who knows, I mean, oaks are the ones that emit some of the highest VOCs, right? But I think that there's potential for them to be providing a lot of other services we're not paying attention to. And I would say that like varied structure is the most important thing. So I don't think that we need to be planting an entire canopy over the city, but I think we need to think about like the 3-dimensional structure and really enhancing that, especially if we're thinking about animals as well. And also there's a lot of evidence that people like that too, right? Like that diversity, that people's health and well-being is enhanced by greater diversity of structure around them, greater biodiversity. Yeah. And I think maybe that's why we're all struggling under COVID right now. Like we're all stuck home with the same 3 people screaming at us and all the time. Like I can hear my family chewing from across the house at this point. It's getting crazy, right? And so diversity, I'm starting to really think that we've got to like get at the mechanism between the diversity and health relationship more than ever, because I think it's lacking all over the place.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Melissa. I mean, your passion for a variety of topics is pretty extraordinary. And I think we've all found one that now we are going to be more opinionated about. That I think I'm going to take small parcels. So there's lots of others for you all to take and to run with.
HOAs, get rid of them. I hope my next paper gets rid of every HOA in Fort Collins.
Yeah. And once we have dinner parties, now we're going to have lots of really opinionated topics on Fort Collins.
Yeah, the Urban Sustainability Research Network. We'll have some drinks and dinner at Avo's or something. Hopefully I'll get to see all of you soon. Thanks for having me. A bunch of my students and also my undergrads and my graduate students are a part of this. And so they have a lot of access to a lot of my resources too. And they also can text me and make sure I respond to you when my emails box is too thick with stuff. So yeah, good luck. This is an awesome, awesome project. And I can't wait to see what you come up with. I'll keep watching too.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I'd encourage you to take a little more grace with yourself and with your loved ones in your household tonight. We'll come back next week from 5 to 6 and start to dig into the real work. So take care and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.